Hi, Sue. Welcome.
Hi, Hazel.
Welcome. Thanks for joining me. I'm really excited about this conversation. Any excuse to chat to you, Sue. So, I guess maybe we should
Likewise.
we should just say that, we do know each other, right? We haven't met in person though, have we?
We haven't, but we just compared heights and decided that we are approximately the same height.
Yeah. But we know each other through the Flow Center, and we've had many a
Yes,
Zoom conversation over the
we
years. It's
have.
been probably a few years now, 5, something like that we've known each other.
Probably about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was great to be introduced to you through the Flow Center and
hmm
to work with you in that space. And then the Flow conference that we've just taken part in.
Yeah.
And I obviously follow you on social media and
hmm
really love doing that and like following all your amazing adventures.
Yeah. I mean, I do follow you on social media as well, actually. And I think it's worth saying that I had read your book actually before I'd met you, Flow
Hmm.
in Sport.
Hmm.
So I don't know, maybe let's start by if you could just give the listener kind of like a sort of general overview of what your career has looked like. I know that's probably difficult because you've done so much stuff, but I don't know, yeah, maybe just give us a quick overview.
Sure, I'll keep it flow centric. So well, my first degree was in human movement studies, and my plan initially was I was going to be a physical education teacher, which I did for a year or so, and um, and then I've always had an interest in the mental side of sport. So always had an interest in sport, and that was why I studied human movement studies, was through my own interest in sport, both as a participant and as a coach. And so it just seemed like a next pathway. But then I started learning about this field called sports psychology, which was very new. So I'm going back a long time, Hazel, like probably before you were born. No, maybe not quite that, but 1980s, I did my first degree, and that's when I first learned about sports psychology. And all of that information was coming from North America, like all of the books and the research and so on. And I just became increasingly curious about it. And to the point that I decided I was going to pursue grad studies in sport psychology. And because all of the information was coming out of North America, I left my hometown of Sydney, Australia, and arrived at the University of Illinois, which was an amazing academic institution where I had the most fantastic learning experience, in terms of there was really good professors and fantastic grad students that were passionate about sports psychology from all over the world. So it was really a hub. However, one experience that always stays with me when I talk about going from Sydney to Champaign, Illinois, is flew into Chicago, nice big city, then got on this tiny little plane, flew to Champaign. And anyone that has been to the University of Illinois will probably understand my experience. And anyway, all around me, there was nothing but cornfields, and it was totally flat. And I arrived in cornfields, and I'm like, where am I? And it was only like a 5-minute drive to the university, which is very, very impressive. But the university is Champaign, Urbana-Champaign.
Right.
It's the primary focal point for why those twin towns exist. And it was quite a challenge, like a living challenge, to go from living in Sydney, which is a beautiful city, and I really love the coast and
Mm.
the ocean, to going Midwest US. And I was doing triathlon at the time, and I just remember the only time you could get a hill was going over an overpass. Literally, that was it. It
Wow.
was just like so totally flat, and you'd have wind in every direction. And when it was snowing, you'd have horizontal snow coming at you. Yeah, it was a challenge. And I know that when we talk about flow today, we'll be talking about the importance of challenge. So that was probably an unwanted challenge, but the actual learning was amazing. And that's where I learned about flow. So, would not have
Okay.
passed up that opportunity for anything.
Yes, I mean, that was probably when people were first starting to talk about flow. I mean, when
Hmm.
did Csikszentmihályi come out with his first book? Was that not
Yeah.
too far before that, I guess?
Well, it was 1975, and I came across it when trying to narrow down a research topic for my master's thesis. It was going to be in the area of motivation. I knew that much, and it was going to be preferably in the area of elite performance. And then I stumbled across this book that you're referring to, which is called Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. And that was his first book, Csikszentmihályi's first book. And that was written in 1975, but I was reading it. So when I went to the University of Illinois, that was 1986. And I was there for
Okay.
2 years. And interestingly, for all the climbing enthusiasts, there's actually a chapter in here on rock climbers,
Mm-hmm.
the flow experience in rock climbing. And that, I think that was partly influenced by Csikszentmihályi, his passion in terms of sport was a mountain climber himself
Mm-hmm.
in Italy when he was growing up there as a young person.
Yeah, doesn't he have this beautiful passage about the sort of the climber being focused on the climb and not getting to the top or something like that? I feel like I've
Yeah,
read that
that
passage,
rings a
yeah.
bell. Yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, so I think, so some people listening might not know what flow is, or
Hmm.
they might have a kind of intuition around what flow is, but maybe not understand that it's actually like a subject of academia. Like, it would be cool to hear, you probably have been asked this a million times, but your definition of flow, and but also what it means to you personally, and then we can kind of
Mm,
go back to how you started
sure.
studying it back then.
Yeah, sure. That's always interested to talk about flow. So flow, I think at a just a simple definition level, is a state of total focus on what you're doing. So, whatever task or activity you're involved in, you're totally focused on that. Your attention isn't wandering. And then there are other characteristics that are associated with it. And that is that you tend to be in a challenging situation. Again, very relevant for climbing. And that to achieve flow, you need to be able to have a skill set that matches that challenge. And so flow is operationally defined as occurring when you're in a challenging situation, and we're talking about a personally challenging situation where you're bringing a high skill set able to meet that challenge. So that's one of the preconditions for flow to occur. And then flow is associated with a number of very positive qualities that we can go into. Um, Tends to be seen as one of the most enjoyable experiences that you have when you're actually experiencing flow. So it then becomes motivating to experience flow, um, because if you've experienced it, you want to get back to that state. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I don't know if it was his first book focused on that, but one of Csikszentmihalyi's books really focused on that kind of well-being quality, right? And he went around the world and he was kind of trying to find out sort of, you know, what what were people doing when they felt at their best and they
Mm-hmm.
felt most happy and they felt
Mm-hmm.
most like life was something worth living. And he
Mm.
kind of came to this conclusion, right, that it was no
Mm-hmm.
matter where you were in the world, whether you were like a
Mm-hmm.
factory worker or
That's
a
true.
business person or an
Mm-hmm.
elite athlete, it was those moments when we're in that state of flow that seemed to be like the most fulfilling and the most people enjoyed it the most.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
Definitely.
like a real intersection, I guess, as well between flow and well-being, not just flow and performance.
That's a very good point, and that was one that I learned through being mentored by Csikszentmihalyi. So to continue my experience at the U of I after reading this book Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, I saw that Csikszentmihályi was based at the University of Chicago, which was just 3 hours away by car. So I decided I would try getting in touch with him to see what he thought about the idea of me doing research on flow in sport. And he was very supportive and very generous with his time too. So that's how I initially got to be in touch with him. and yeah, had a wonderful influence on my understanding of flow, and on like challenging me to, and mentoring me through my experience. So yeah, that was a great opportunity that being at the University of Illinois afforded me, in that I found the book and read the book, and then found that the person wasn't too far away from where I was, and kind of just went from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's so lucky, isn't it? I mean, it's
Hmm.
sort of like, when the stars really align,
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that was one of those times.
yeah. And how
Mm.
long after that did you write with Csikszentmihályi the book Flow in Sport?
Yeah, it's quite some time later, actually.
Okay.
Um, I did look at flow in my master's, and then I went on to do my PhD, and then it was after my PhD, and I then returned to Australia and was an academic in sports psychology, and I went across to do a sabbatical at the University of Chicago with Mike, and that's where the book actually the idea for it, and then the development of it and the early writing. So that was actually quite a bit fast forward into 1997. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Just
going
to,
back to your point, sorry,
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna say to clarify, Mike is
Ah,
the sort
yes.
of the name that he was known as, right? But his
Yes,
actual name is Mihai or something like that, right?
correct. Yeah,
But
so
he
he's
was known as
Hungarian
Mike.
born,
Yeah.
and his name is Mihai Csikszentmihályi, and because he went to the US to study himself, and ended up staying there, and then living out his life there, and living in America. I think he found that it was easier to go by Mike than to
Yeah.
ask people to get their head around Mihai, let alone Csikszentmihályi.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so but going back to my masters, it was actually in my masters that I realized, going back to a point you said about the quality of experience and well-being being so integral to why flow is important, and so what I how I learned that, I guess, was I was looking at motivation and perceived ability and flow experience in elite athletes, and I had the opportunity to interview a small subset of those athletes, and in my interview I was really focusing on flow. And what I found was that the athletes were so appreciative of an opportunity to speak about their experience, as opposed to their performance, their achievements,
Mm,
their outcomes. And that was a real eye opener for me.
mm.
Um,
That's really
and
interesting.
and and definitely, from Csikszentmihályi's point of view, the quality of experience is why flow is important. It's about the
Hmm.
quality of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we say that, it's like it's quite weird, isn't it? Because we just so rarely talk about it. It's I don't know
Mm,
what it is about our culture or society or the way humans are wired, but as climbers, you know, as a coach of climbers,
mhm,
getting people to talk about their actual experience, they so quickly gravitate back to how they felt at the top of the climb, how they feel having done the climb, how
yeah.
they feel about trying it again if they didn't complete it. I'm like, but how was it? How was the experience for you? What was happening in your mind?
Mm,
Did you were you having fun? Did you enjoy it? And even when they say, yeah, I enjoy it, like I was such a relief when I got to the top, or if they quickly come back to, so
mm,
it's interesting from the perspective of a coach to um use the questions and the language to get people to actually reflect on their experience.
mm,
And that's really interesting that when these athletes started
mhm.
reflecting, they really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
um
they did. Yeah, and
that's
one of the
cool.
things that stands out for me is I interviewed athletes from a diverse range of sports, and I would find at the end of my interview with them, um, we'd get up to leave the room because it was a face-to-face interview, and I'd have several of them thank me for interviewing them and thank me for asking them about the quality of their experience rather than their stats,
Yeah.
their goals, their performance outcomes, and so on. And I guess that's a reflection on what society values too, right? So, like,
Mm.
it could be the coach, it could be the parents, it could be the spectators. A whole lot of sources reinforces that what's important is what you achieve. And I guess that's true
Mhm.
outside of sport as well, isn't it?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
a great quote from Csíkszentmihályi is that, in the final analysis, it's the quality of our experience that determines the extent to which life was worth living.
Yeah, it's a great quote.
So, yeah, it
Yeah.
is a great quote.
And it's all we have is like this string of moments, right? Moment
Hmm.
by moment by moment that all add
Yeah.
up until, the end. And it's sort of a kind of a great sadness in a way that we can
Mm,
spend so much time thinking about potential moments in the future without being in the one that we're in right now. And I think that's what's so wonderful about
mm,
flow is that yeah, it helps athletes perform at their best. Being
mm,
in flow is when we do our best, and it's probably when we get the
hmm,
best results, and it's when we achieve our goals. But it's also such a rich experience, to be
mm.
in flow. And I wonder, how was
That's
it for
right.
you personally at that time? Were you thinking, oh, how can I be in flow more in my own um sports? And because you
Yeah.
you were
Yeah.
quite a serious athlete at the time, right? And were
Hmm.
you starting to play around with that then? And what conclusions
Mm,
could you kind of make in those early days around what were the actual precursors to flow? What sort of environments helped you get into flow?
mm.
And mindsets and ways of managing your experience?
Wow. Great questions. I'll have to ask you the same. Um, so for me, reading Beyond Boredom and Anxiety gave me a language to understand the best moments I'd experienced in sport. And for me, sport involved not just one sport like yourself. You've been like so focused and done such amazing things in the world of climbing. So for me, I was involved in many different sports, and I'd remember each of them, and they were quite different sports, but I'd remember each of them as those times in flow were like, oh, that's what really motivated me to take part or to try this other sport, and to want to remain involved in the experience of flow. And it was only on reading the book that I had a language for these experiences. And also, I could then understand that they weren't just random. They definitely seemed like they were random until you understand that there's this psychological concept that's been well studied, and there's a lot of support for it across different domains, like you were saying, whether it's a factory worker or a flying business person or an elite athlete, that the support for flow across all life domains is very strong. And so as I was starting to read more about flow, I was like, wow, this doesn't have to be random. And I think that's what, is really wonderful about the experience, is that we can go from viewing it as, oh, we were really lucky to experience flow, to, oh, well, maybe there's some things we can do in our mindset, as you say, to make it more likely that flow will occur. And so that was my early experience after starting to read in flow, and then to have a language that would help me to go back and reinterpret, I guess, those experiences, and then seek to find more of those experiences, which for me, I think a key factor was learning to be more in the present moment, learning to focus more on what I was doing and not to be consumed by anxiety or by thinking forward to outcomes and so on. And that's been a lifelong journey. It's definitely got room for improvement still in that.
Well,
Yeah,
it'd be boring if there wasn't room for improvement, wouldn't it?
true,
But I
true.
think that brings us nicely on to kind of your, I guess second body of work, I suppose, which is
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness.
Mm,
Um, and it would be great. I think it's funny, like flow and mindfulness are two of the things I'm most interested in, but they've got such misconceptions around them. So it'd be cool for you to define mindfulness in how you
mm,
see it. Do you like the phrase mindfulness, by the way? Because I know a lot of
mm,
people do not like this word and use other words. So be good to
mm.
hear what you think about that.
I don't personally have a problem with it. I know that some people will pull apart the word mindful and this play on words, the mind is full. Well, no, it's
Mm.
not. When you're being mindful. Um, but a key distinction is that when you're mindful, you're totally focused. However, you're not thinking about what you're focused on. Um, you're not getting involved in this analysis that, as athletes, we can often get involved in over analysis. And, you might be climbing and you start to second guess, well, is this the best hold, or should I be doing something else, or should I be trying to vary the route that I'm taking, and then you start getting caught up in that, and you're no longer actually paying attention to where your hands and your feet are at that present moment. And so that's what mindfulness is basically, is it's paying attention in the present moment. And that's where there's such an overlap, I believe, between mindfulness and flow, because I've previously defined flow as being a total focus on the task at hand, and mindfulness is paying attention in the present moment. John Kabat-Zinn has a nice simple definition of mindfulness, and that is paying attention in a particular way. And there's three characteristics: in the present moment, on purpose, so you decide what you're going to pay attention to, and non-judgmentally, which tends to
Mm,
be, for our human minds, the most challenging aspect, is to not get
mm,
caught up in that judgment evaluation of good, bad, how am I doing, what are other people thinking of me, so on, so on, so on. Because once you go there, obviously you're no longer focused on the task in the present moment, you are into thinking.
yeah. I mean, it's kind of just to get into the semantics, but I wonder if one can be present if there's that judgment, or whether the judgment
Hmm.
actually just automatically brings you out of the present moment.
Hmm.
But I suppose it can be quite subtle, that judgment. It doesn't have to sound like you're doing it wrong kind of thing. It can also just be like a this is nice or this is unpleasant kind of sense of judgment,
Yeah,
can't it?
true.
Like often hear people talk about to be mindful of a sunset, a beautiful sunset, is to actually just absorb the nice sunset as you see it, how it actually is, rather than
Hmm.
going, oh, this is so nice, this sunset, or this is nicer than the
Hmm.
sunset I saw
Yeah.
last time, or this sunset
Yeah.
would be better without the clouds how they are. It's sort of, I guess
Yeah.
it's there's an acceptance to mindfulness of
Mm.
the state of being, of your state of consciousness as it is in that moment, rather than
Mhm.
desire to change it.
Mhm.
um and so I guess it also, an interesting question is, we've defined flow, we've defined mindfulness. What are the
Mm.
key differences between these two states? Can one be mindfully in flow? Can one be in flow when you're being mindful? Let's pull those two states apart a little bit.
Mm. I think it's quite a complex one to pull apart, and there are varying viewpoints on it. For me, I like to look at it as mindfulness is a skill that facilitates flow by helping us to learn to be more in the present moment and helping us to connect with the senses. So, like your example of the sunset, like if you were being mindful, you would be noticing the colors, you might be noticing the temperature of the air, the changing colors, the environment around you. You might also notice sounds that you hear, you might be aware of your breathing and so on. So that's the immersion and in the present moment. And rather than what we would normally do, which is we'll probably be taking photos and then we might want to say, well, is this photo good enough? Well, no, I need to take some more and need to get this right. And it's like, then the sunset's gone.
Mhm. Yeah.
And uh, because you're not allowing yourself to get absorbed in that present moment experience. Um, so I think that for me, there's a lot more similarities between mindfulness and flow than there are differences. I think that mindfulness as a point of difference, I mean, it doesn't require you to be in a challenging situation and to bring high skill to it, like flow does, for example. Well, most instances of flow that we're talking about in a
Yeah.
sport such as climbing are going to involve challenge and skill. Um, However, having said that, it's pretty challenging to be mindful, isn't it? Particularly if you start, like if you're new to that practice, it's like when I'm working with clients and I'm working with them on mindfulness, I might hear them say to me, oh yeah, no, mindfulness is great, but it's not for me because my mind's too
Mhm.
busy. And so I
Mhm.
can't do that. And so they bring this preconception. And well, everyone's mind's like that until you take on the skill. So, it can be quite challenging. However, it's not a difficult skill. Like what you're actually being asked to do is quite simple when you're being mindful. It's more about being able to
Yeah.
let go of all of those things that we've started to bring to how we live our lives, which can be very much dominated by thinking. And
Mhm.
we can fail to see a distinction between our thoughts and ourselves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Maybe let's park that for one moment because
sure,
that could open a
sure,
huge can of worms.
that could.
Um, yeah, I mean, from a kind of lived experience perspective, for me, the two states
Mm,
feel quite different,
okay,
even though they're both happening in the present moment. And I think that but for me, mindfulness brings a kind of a sense of calm and
okay,
like an observational style.
true.
Um, things for me slow down when I'm mindful. Um, Whereas
Hmm.
in flow, yeah, and when I'm mindful as well, I have a sense of a self.
Hmm.
Um, Even though it can also come out of that sense of self, I'm still like very aware of when there feels like self and when there doesn't feel like self, if you know what I mean. Like,
Mm,
um, if you're mindful of the space of the room, you can, for a moment at a time, you can be the room, you can just be your visual experience of the room. But
mm,
then you might quite quickly come out of that and be like, oh yeah, I'm back in my head, and I'm
hmm.
thinking about
Yeah,
my
yeah,
recent mindful experience of the room. A thought arises about that. Whereas for me,
yeah.
flow, I think I'm engrossed in it for longer, and there's less of that
Hmm.
observational state.
True.
Like for my
Yeah, it's a really
and
good point.
but I wonder if like you're really good at mindfulness and you can stay in a mindful state for longer, maybe it feels more like flow because you're more
Maybe.
immersed in the present moment for longer. Whereas when I'm mindful, I flit in and out of being mindful and present a lot. And I think,
Mm,
as you become better at meditation, you notice, don't you, like, oh, that was a thought. Now I'm being mindful of the sound again.
hmm.
Oh, that's another thought, whereas when I'm in flow, it's like I become the task. I lose my sense of
Yeah,
self and I lose that like observational style to my
yeah,
experience, I suppose.
yeah. No, I think you make a really good point. The observing is actually a skill in mindfulness. Learning to be able to observe what's arising without necessarily having to react to it, or to be able to accept. So acceptance is a big part of mindfulness. And so what you might be mindful of is you might be mindful of your pain. maybe mindfulness is used to help with chronic pain. So you
Mm.
could bring a mindful awareness to that, and doesn't mean that you really want that experience, but you learn to be with it and to sort of notice what are the sensations and where am I feeling the pain, and is there anywhere that I'm not feeling the pain, and so on, and observing, as you say, your experience. Where in flow you're much more actively involved, aren't you, in the performance of the task, or in the, I mean, it might not be a task, it might be that you're reading, but you can get totally absorbed in that reading, and that could be a flow experience as well. So we haven't talked about it, but flow can occur at different levels of challenge and skill. It doesn't have to just be that you're always pushing the limits to
Yeah.
experience it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because I think a lot of people, and this is because the way that flow has been talked about, right, in
Yeah,
popular
that's very
media
true.
and
Yeah.
etc. And this idea, because that's what makes flow exciting, is that it's the people dropping in on huge,
Mm-hmm.
down mountains and huge
Mm.
skateboard ramps and it's very
Yeah,
much flow is associated with extreme sports,
it is
which does make it
in the
exciting and
media.
interesting, but it also, I think, makes it feel somewhat exclusive to people.
I
And
think you're right.
I really like Cameron's example of like, you might walk into the house and your partner just throws some keys to you from the other side of the room
Mm,
and you like snatch them.
yeah.
There's a few moments of flow there, or like you watch
Mm,
a glass about to fall off the table and you
mm-hmm,
do
mm-hmm,
this crazy technical contortion of
mm-hmm,
your body and your reactions are lightning fast and you grab that mug, and that's a flow moment.
mm,
And you can tell it's a flow moment because everyone's like, whoa, and you feel like really
mm,
elated all of a sudden because you're like, how
mm,
did that happen?
mm,
And I think, you know, in the literature, we don't maybe talk enough about the sort of more mundane moments of flow that do kind of
yeah.
puncture through life.
Mm,
So
yeah,
yeah, I don't
that's
know,
very true.
in the work that you do, and maybe it's worth just saying sort of actually, you're a mindfulness teacher and a coach and you help people find flow. All sorts of people though, right? Not just athletes.
Yeah.
Um,
So my main
yeah.
work is as a psychologist, and in my psychology work, um, I may be helping people develop awareness of mindfulness and teach mindfulness skills. If the person is interested, and the context is relevant, then teach about flow state as well, and so the mindfulness skills might be one of other skills that are about helping people to be able to more readily experience flow. Um, but I do want to emphasize that your point about flow has been probably sensationalized. I mean, there's some lovely literature out there, adrenaline pumping literature, I guess, about flow in extreme sports, and flow is this, really high level experience, and it's amazing. And yes, all of that is true, and it can be something that occurs much less sensationally. And Csikszentmihályi, if anyone actually goes to the source, so Csikszentmihályi, in his writings, he has interviewed people at the very top of what they're doing, Nobel Prize winners, for example, in his book Creativity, looking at flow behind the creative process. And then he's interviewed people who are living their lives in flow across different cultures. And so his book, Finding Flow, The Psychology of Engagement with Everyday Life, that's about flow as a way of living life,
Mm-hmm.
aside from performance, aside from high stakes. So recognizing that, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm. And how do you approach that with the people you work with? Um, I mean, I guess, we can come back to mindfulness a little bit here as well. I mean, how are these states of mindfulness and flow improving people's well-being?
I think one of the main ways is by teaching people how to focus on the present moment and to notice where their attention is. And I think that the type of society we live in, most of us, is geared towards a lot of progress, doing things quickly, multitasking, and being dominated by our thinking minds. And so we might end up in the past or in the future, in our where thoughts are. And so teaching people to recognize, well, where are you right now? Are you able to come to the present moment? And that can be like a real door opener for people that have kind of forgotten what, as
Mm.
kids, we know naturally about living life in the present moment. And I think that's a critically important skill that mindfulness and flow offer in terms of helping people's well-being. And then related to that, anxiety is very prevalent, whether we're talking about people facing daily life challenges, whether that's in relationship or in financial situations, financial challenges, or perhaps not knowing where they're going or feeling like they're procrastinating, all the way through to someone's got any very high level goals that they're trying to achieve and they're anxious about that. And so being able to bring mindfulness and flow to help people manage anxieties, I find in my work is um, is very relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And um, flow and mindfulness are kind of states that we're in the moment, right? Um,
Hmm.
but one can practice mindfulness. Does one
Mm.
practice flow, or does one practice
Mm.
things that help them access flow?
Yeah, the
Um,
latter. Yeah.
and what do you do with people so that they, is it the case that you're helping people practice mindfulness, which enables them to get into flow more?
Mm.
Or are we doing other things, and that might distinguish your work a little bit from, say, what I do, which is a bit more explicitly helping people access flow, and using some mindfulness tools, but also um, there's other things you can do, right, to help someone access flow. Um, and what does that actually look like for someone in their everyday life? Like, if someone's listening to this and they're like going, "Oh, I'm
Hmm.
interested in this." you
Hmm.
know, are we starting meditation practice? Are we being mindful in everyday life? Like, what does the actual process
Both
look like
things.
here?
Yeah, yeah, both things. So mindfulness or meditation, if we were to use that term, meditation, generally, if you're helping someone to develop that as a practice, you will introduce them to the formal practices of meditation, which could be breathing practices, body scans, um, connecting with the senses. And then the other component is more the informal training of helping people to notice where their attention is as they go through their day, and then to have some skill at bringing that attention back. Because it's great to practice to sit down or lie down or stand, whatever, and stop what you're doing and practice meditation. That's really beneficial. However, if that's just a separated component of your life, and then the rest of your life is kind of like mad chaos, running from one thing to the next, and not aware of your experience, then you're not actually benefiting too much from that meditation experience, other than the immediate benefits that you'll get from calming and slowing down and maybe decreasing anxiety and so on. So, but equally important is the ability to learn to be mindful in everyday life as we go through our day, and that can be very challenging for most of
Mm-hmm.
us, because it's fundamentally a shift, isn't it, for most people? Um, it, unless you've been practicing with mindfulness and meditation for a good part of your life, then it's going to be foreign to be able to operate in that space of being in the present moment as you go through what you're doing for most people.
Yeah.
So then teaching people about the application of mindfulness to how you live your life. So yes, mindfulness is a skill, but it's also it's more than a skill if we step back and think about living mindfully. That's
Hmm.
that's more comprehensive than a skill that you practice.
Yeah, and would you call that trait mindfulness? You know, like the trait
Hmm,
of being mindful when one goes about their
could
life?
well be. Yeah, could
I don't
well
know, I've
be,
just
or
heard that
develop.
trait and state
Okay.
distinction
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we certainly use that trait and state distinction for concepts like anxiety. And I also have used it in flow, in the measurement of flow. I've developed self-report scales to assess flow, and I do that at both the state and the dispositional level. So a state measure would be someone's just completed a climb, give them a questionnaire asking them about what their experience was like in that climb. Whereas you might more generally just get someone to answer a trait or dispositional measure of flow, which is asking them, well, how often do you find yourself focused on what you're doing and feeling like the challenge and skill match when you're
Hmm.
climbing, for example? And so I guess we could do the same with mindfulness, state and trait, or state and disposition.
Hmm. What are some of the main barriers that you see for people to access um, trait mindfulness and just accessing flow as well? You know, what are those sort of big obstacles that prevent people from being mindful or being in flow?
I think there's probably a few, isn't there? Um, Being very connected to your thinking self, the part of yourself that is concerned with thoughts and with planning and sort of moving between past and future. I mean, that's definitely a barrier, or it makes it more challenging. And Perhaps a high level of achievement motivation could also
Mm-hmm.
be an obstacle in a way, like if you're always wanting to achieve the next thing, like perfectionist, for example.
Mm.
um, you achieve something and then, well, that's not good enough, and so it needs to be better next time, and what's this next thing that I'm going to do? So if you're always chasing something because you're never truly satisfied with what you're doing or what you're achieving, then you might get over focused on those goals, which are tied in with attainment of a certain level of performance or recognition, whether that's fame or fortune or whatever. Like if we goals can get in the way, I guess.
Mm.
Um, Depending on what our perspective is of how we want to live our lives. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's not like there's a right or a wrong way either. Like people might decide that mindfulness and flow aren't relevant to their life, and that's fine. You know, um, I wouldn't want to be um, portraying that there's any judgment there. I just feel that there's so much to offer through mindfulness and flow that it's worth our investment of our energy into becoming better at living life in a mindful way, living life where we can access flow at least some of the time in what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And have you seen that with your clients, you know, the people you work with, that when they come to you, they might not have much mindfulness and flow in your life? And, you know, what sort of positive results have you seen when working with people?
Hmm. I guess if I don't know if this is true generally, but like when someone comes to see a psychologist, they often wait till they're struggling with something, right? Although the field of performance psychology, which I work into, is about starting from where you are, which is a higher than average level of functioning, and wanting to extend
Mm,
that even further. So that's its own sort of area within psychology. However, for many people, the work of psychology is when you're not coping and you need some skills to cope better or change your perspective. And anxiety again is, I'm finding, is just showing up so much. And I guess there's many reasons in the world that we live in that people would have anxiety, right?
mhm,
um, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of difficulty, um, there's yeah, life isn't always a positive experience for us, and anxiety can be one of the things that results from that. And so what I find is, to answer your question, that helping people develop skills to manage their experience, whether that's anxiety, whether it's overthinking, whether it's perfectionism, so helping people to have a skill set that they can draw on to allow them to be the best versions of themselves in each experience that they're showing up for, that matters for them.
mhm. That's cool. Um, yeah, going to the more performance side of things.
Hmm.
You know, you just mentioned how sort of like focusing on the achievement, focusing on the outcome can be some of the bigger barriers to accessing flow. And that's certainly like what I see as a coach
Mm.
in climbing is and I think climbing's particularly bad for it because it's really black and white whether we succeed or not. It's not like something like surfing where you ride the wave and if you fall off at the end, it's not like that whole experience was wasted, a failure. I mean, that's not how it should be in climbing either, but that's how it can be perceived, right? That if you fall off the last move of a climb, it's all wasted somehow, because you really have to finish a climb for it to be a success. Like you only complete a climb when you get to the top, right? It's quite black or white. Like
Right.
much more so even than a with team sports, because team sports, you might score like 5 goals, but your team still loses. Um, so yeah, climbing can be quite bad for it. And I think a lot of people get very distracted when they're on the wall because they're thinking about the success or the failure. They're thinking about getting to the top. They're thinking about how they'll feel if they don't complete the climb on this go. Those sorts of things are kind of running through their heads, and then it causes that kind of a bit of anxiety, tense up. The breathing
Mm.
becomes irregular. As soon as you add a bit more tension in the arms, you become much more fatigued, much more quickly. And it's really all happening on the wall, like, and I guess another thing that's unique to climbing is when you step into the performance, you're kind of in it, there's no going back down.
Yeah.
It's not like
Yeah.
in football where they blow
Yeah.
the whistle and you rest kind of thing, like you're in it.
Yeah.
Um, what have been some effective strategies that you've used to help people let go of those outcomes a little bit? Because what's difficult is a lot of people come to me for coaching so that they can
Mm.
achieve better outcomes, so that they can climb harder grades and tick harder routes and
Mm.
complete their projects. And then you're actively getting them to let go a little bit of those outcomes so that they can
Mm.
climb more fluidly in the present moment. And it
Mm.
seems like a tall order sometimes. And I'd be interested to see, what that process has looked like for you,
Mm.
and how you get people to be less focused on outcomes.
Mm. Yeah, it definitely is an important area, a challenging area. It's interesting to hear you talk about climbing that way, because I guess for myself, um, having dabbled in a bit of climbing, I've never really done it to want to achieve anything. It's just that I really love the experience and the challenge, and being able to take on a challenge and see what my body can do. And and yet I totally appreciate, like, probably the level of climbers that you're working with, that the achievement of the climb does become important, and people, there's the grading system, I guess, and how, what's your best level that you've climbed at and so on. So there is a
Yeah.
lot of emphasis on the outcomes. So going back to when I was researching for my master's and PhD, looking at flow, I was looking at psychological factors associated with flow. And one of the key factors I found is that a mastery orientation, which is when you're focused on improving on the task and personal improvement and learning and so on, what we call these days growth mindset. But before it was called growth mindset, there was mastery orientation and there was ego or outcome orientation. And so I found that the mastery orientation is much more associated with the experience of flow than the outcome orientation. And that makes sense, because if you're focused on the outcome you want to achieve, you've taken away some important attention from what you're doing at the time. So the outcome can be a very important motivator in the lead up, and give you the motivation to put in the hard work and the preparation. However, when you're actually in the performance, focusing on the performance and on what you're doing, that is being mindful, perhaps being in flow, that's where you're going to be more likely to get into flow, and you're more likely to have a better level of performance. So paradoxically, by not focusing on the performance, but focusing on the task and letting the outcomes take care of themselves, and I'm sure you've experienced this as a climber, if you can let go of what that outcome is that you want to achieve and just focus on that particular challenge of that climb that's in front of you, and how are you going to get your body to take on that challenge and be present in your body and with your breathing, so that you're maximizing your experience. It's more positive. You're not caught up in self-doubt or worry, and you're also much more likely to have a successful climb. Has that been your
Yeah.
experience?
No, totally, yeah. And the work we do at Strong Mind is kind of to help people become, what I would say is like more process oriented.
Mm, yeah,
Um,
that's another
and
term for mastery, is
totally,
process. Yeah.
yeah. I really like the term mastery, but I feel like you see so many sort of masterclass this and
Ah,
master
true.
that and master this that I think people don't really actually engage with what it truly means. But for me
Mm,
personally, I've really tried to orient my climbing around the concept of mastery. So it's not I want to achieve this goal, that goal, that goal, although goals help me in my journey, but the
mhm,
journey is really about mastering the sport. And it's I don't like the word spiritual either, but there is something it's not spiritual, but I don't know, it's just deeply meaningful, I suppose. There's intrinsic value in the journey of mastery. And I think that throughout the whole of humanity, we've
mm,
seen that, we valued
mm,
that in our
mm,
culture, right? These master crafts people
mm,
and warriors, and
mm,
especially in Eastern cultures. And how I've climbed since I was 6. How can I? And I've focused most of my attention in my life towards this thing, right? So
mm,
that's mastery. Um, and
totally.
so, a lot of my goals, I have tried to pick them based on how they can continually shape me as a climber. And I think when you're that invested in something, you can see that. But obviously, I do work with a lot of people who climbing is their hobby, and it's not something that they you know, that they have mastered maybe to the similar level as like whatever their career is in, for example. You
Hmm.
know, climbing being my career somewhat as well. Um, but yeah, when you kind of you adopt that idea of mastery, you generally become more process oriented because you realize there's no end. And I think that's
Exactly.
sort of the weird illusion that we often live in is that, you know, when I've climbed this grade or when I've become this type of climber or when I've got to this level as in the company that I work for, I've somehow arrived, I'm there.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
therefore we kind of like shift our attention to this like future condition. Whereas mastery is really about going, this journey never ends. I will be devoted to this without the need for results until my dying day, you know, and even when my
Mm.
physical body becomes weaker, my mastery, it will look a bit different, but the desire for mastery will still be there, but it will be more focused on technique and mental challenge rather than necessarily climbing the hardest things anymore. Um, but it is hard because I think, you know, those concepts are really not part of our culture in the Western world. It
Mm.
is so it getting people to really take it seriously and to find meaning in them, I think, is a struggle. And I know I've sort of diverted off course a bit, but I think, you know, there's different levels of this, isn't it? And one of them is just to see, okay, you've got this project, you want to complete it. But if you focus too much on the outcome, you won't you won't be in the task. You won't learn anything. You won't develop as a climber. You won't enjoy it,
Hmm.
and also your performance will suck because your mind is elsewhere. Okay, so there's
Yeah.
that, but then there's also a how do I even view the process of myself as a climber or as whatever you're doing from that kind of bird eye perspective? You know, are you doing this to become to master something for that intrinsic value, or are you doing it for other reasons? And I think I listened to such a good podcast yesterday about status, and it really made me think that like at its core, some of those like desires for outcome and achievement really come from that human desire
Yeah.
to um you know, for status. And so lots of
Mm.
people say, like, well, I don't have external motivations. I'm not a professional climber. I don't have sponsors. I don't have this and that. It's like, yeah, but within your friendship group, of course you're going to care if you're the worst climber in your friendship group. Of course you're
Mm.
going to enjoy the praise you get when you climb your next biggest thing. And I think that, you know, flow is all about experience, but flow states do not help you with your status whatsoever because no one knows that you're in them, you know? And that's why I
That
don't,
is classic.
you know, I
Yeah.
think that's why we probably don't value flow and mindfulness in these
Yeah.
ways because the experience base and our personal internal experiences we don't get to share with others, whereas achievements we get to share with others. And often
You've
achievements
hit
aren't
on
even
such an
worth
important
anything.
point. Like that is just such an important point that you've hit on, about status, which is, a big driver for the outcome or ego orientation is is about that, and society notices that, and so society rewards that. And you're totally spot on about our experience is our own internal happening that, I guess, well, one thing that as I was listening to you talk, I was reflecting on how, and I've known you for long enough to know that mastery orientation is critical to your mindset, to why you do what you do, and I believe it's a really big part of why you're as successful a climber as what you are. Um, and maybe other, very successful climbers in the world, and you could share whether they seem to have that orientation as well. But definitely, I see that in you, and that's I think a great example of how having this orientation towards mastery is is going to help you get a lot further than if you don't have that orientation. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I look around, I've got a lot of friends who are professional climbers, you know, and
mm.
I think a lot of them do have a sort of deep orientation towards mastery, but maybe haven't put words to it, haven't
Mm,
really reflected
exactly. Yeah.
on what that is, but they have that very strong intrinsic drive to
Mm,
to be better, and not necessarily that doesn't necessarily look like climbing harder grades, but just to be a better climber. um but I think because we're so embedded in a society which values those outcomes, um I think a lot of my friends could be more invested in mastery, um and they'd maybe be at least happier, because I think that I
mm-hmm.
think we can come on to this, like this sort of difference between love and fear-based motivation, that sort of
Huh.
and what always nags at me, and something I find quite frustrating, is that so many of our top athletes, you can tell that they're very fear based. They love climbing, they want to go climbing, and you can see a real joy in their movement, whether they're playing around on an indoor climbing wall or they're like
Mm-hmm.
performing at their best, doing something really hard. There is that intrinsic motivation. I don't think you can actually get to be the top of a sport without that intrinsic driver. And there's lots of debate around this, and people say things like, but you run faster because there's someone chasing you, and that external motivation, you need it there, right? But that's just a race. Like, how do you get to the point of being like an Olympic sprinter? I think how many hundreds of thousands of times you need to motivate to go running.
Mm,
They can't always be externally motivated.
mm,
It's like that love for running that gets you to choose running time and time again over something else has to be because you find to be intrinsic value in running.
mm,
Um, but that said, there's tons of climbing films out there, and you can tell that the climber's not happy. You can tell that they're stressed. You can tell that they're anxious, and they're super fearful of not succeeding in their goal of climbing a particular route. And so it's clear that, a lot of like our role models are somewhat fear based. And I find it frustrating because here I am kind of teaching people that you don't need to be as fear-based, and
mm,
you can find, you can have a mastery mindset, and you can be process oriented, and you can go climbing for the love and for the experience and for finding flow. But
mm,
then there's all these role models on the TV, and they are you know doing a good job of illustrating how fear can be a really effective driver. And yeah, I just wondered how much you'd kind of thought of that, and
mm,
this idea that some of the best things that are happening, some of the best performances are not motivated by the experience or for those intrinsic motivators.
mm. Yeah, that you said a lot of really, really worthwhile points there. Flow is an intrinsically motivating experience. And when I've interviewed athletes or worked with performers, one of the reasons that they're motivated to understand flow and to be able to re-experience it is for that experience of flow, not for what flow brings them, as in outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
achievements, higher level performance, but because it's so damn enjoyable to be in flow.
Mm-hmm.
And so this comes back to the process, rather than the outcome. Like, what is that process like when you're totally engaged in what you're doing? It's really life enhancing, and comes back to that quote by Csikszentmihályi that ultimately, the quality of our experiences determines the extent to which life was worth living. And I think it's a constant struggle, though, in a society that de-emphasizes the quality of experience, and there's good reasons for that. Like you pointed out, that it's an inner experience. It is difficult to sort of have that out there on the TV screen, whereas you can definitely have the achievement out there and watching somebody do something, the performance. But yeah, I think the more that people can do what you're doing, Hazel, which is sharing about the experience and helping people to redefine fear and failure in climbing, because that's all tied up with the experience of climbing and your perceptions of why you're doing what you're doing, and how to actually advance in what you're doing. It comes back to, what are you focused on, and how are you defining success, and how are you defining, and what's motivating you
Mm-hmm.
to do what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think at the heart of that, there's that apparent conflict between performance and well-being, which is, okay, I might be a happier climber if I'm more process oriented, but I'm not going to achieve my goals, right? Because I'm not going to be so crazy dedicated towards them if I didn't have that, like some of those external drivers. And it's not to say that external drivers are bad. Um, but I guess what we would say to that is that, you know, flow does yield the best performances.
Hmm.
And the one of the important um precursors to flow is to find that be present, so not to be distracted by the outcome, but also to
Hmm.
be in that positive state of mind that you get when you intrinsically value the experience, right? And
Mm.
I don't know if you've got any studies that you've done that demonstrate that,
Mm.
but that there is work there, right, to show that 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 positive um, and people who are more internally motivated, more intrinsically motivated, we call that the autotelic
Mm.
personality, right? Those people are performing better and finding flow more readily.
Yeah, so definitely intrinsic motivation is associated with flow. That's another thing I've looked at. Like, I've looked at mastery and outcome orientation, and mastery orientation is more associated with flow. And we're talking associations here, and we're not talking causation, but
Yeah.
they go together. And intrinsic motivation over extrinsic motivation is way more associated with flow. And then if you get more detailed into, there are different types of intrinsic motivation. So if we look at self-determination theory, DC and Ryan's work, there are different types of intrinsic motivation, and the type of intrinsic motivation that is about the experience itself is the one, the valuing of
Yeah.
that is the one that's most associated with flow. Another form of intrinsic motivation is to feel competent, to feel
Yeah.
autonomous, and so on, and that's also associated with flow. And flow,
Mm.
one of the great gifts of flow is that it helps us to develop our sense of competence and belief in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that we could finish on, because we were talking a bit about status, and I think status is really connected to our sense of self-worth. Like if we feel
Mm.
like we have a high status within our community, we feel like we're valued by our community, which bolsters our sense of self-worth, right? But I also think
Hmm.
that there's sources of self-worth that come from confidence in you doing something. And I think flow can really help that, because when you're in flow, when you come out of it, you really feel like you did something well. You really feel like you
Yeah,
mastered a
it's true.
challenge, that was hard for you.
Mm.
And also we learn more in flow, right? Like, because we're so focused on what we're doing, and the skills really match the challenge level. We're doing the most difficult things that we could be doing, and we're doing them
Mm.
well. And I think that
Mm.
really supports our sense of self-confidence and competence and self-efficacy,
Yes,
which
very
gives
much
us
so.
this sense of self-worth that's not dependent on comparisons to other people and that kind of thing.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
Csíkszentmihályi has written about that, that flow is important for the present moment experience, and we have spent quite a bit of time talking about the value of that present moment experience, the quality of experience. And Csíkszentmihályi has also referred to flow being important because it allows us to make significant contributions to humankind.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
we can, by challenging ourselves, we can achieve things that it might be an important scientific discovery or a new
Yeah.
creative way of looking at things, or
Mm.
watching a performer, a climber, that's a climber that's in
Yeah.
flow. It's beautiful to watch. A
Mm-hmm.
surfer or a skier that's in flow. It's beautiful to watch.
Yeah.
And then if you are that person in flow, it's a beautiful experience,
Yeah.
And as you
Yeah.
say, then you come out of that experience valuing it. It was a wonderful experience, and you've developed your competence because you've taken on
Mm-hmm.
that challenge, and you've developed learnings through that, and so you're progressing up in your experience of what life means to you and being able to live the best life that you can. So
Yeah.
that's a really, really important point. Is it is about the qualitative experience, but it's also about what that qualitative experience then facilitates and enables in us in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And we've talked for a while here, so I feel like I could talk to you forever, but just to finish, I'd love to hear what you think is kind of the future of mindfulness and flow. Like, where are we going with these things? Like, how interested are people in these two states? Is our society orientating more towards mindfulness and flow or less? And, what does
Mm.
the future hold in your mind?
Crystal ball question here. I don't know if people are valuing mindfulness and flow more. I think they're, to an extent, yes, because there's more awareness of these concepts, these experiences. They are being written about, they are being talked about. You know, we have mindful eating, we have mindful drawing, whatever, attach a label to it so it sells. But at least it's getting out there. So I think that people across all walks of life are seeing the value of mindfulness in being able to more effectively cope with this high level of demand that we face, and high level of stress, and just taking that opportunity to step back and be in your experience rather than just constantly doing the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a growing awareness of flow as well.
Mm.
It's written about. And now with technology, we can watch programs on YouTube about people talking about flow or being in flow, and so on, and so it's getting out there. I still think we have a long way to go, though. Probably comes back to what we're talking about, what's valued, in
Mm.
society. Um, but perhaps there's a bit of a change towards this valuing of experience more, and the
Mm-hmm.
more that develops, then the more important mindfulness and flow will become. What
Yeah.
do you think? Do you see a
I mean,
change happening?
I definitely see a grow in the interest in mindfulness, and I think technology is helping with that, instead of sort of, I can say, to my students, go and find a meditation app that you like,
Mm,
and people often find
true.
one.
That's true.
Whereas, 50 years ago, it would be travel to India and
Yeah, that's exactly right. Find a guru.
yeah, find a
Sit
guru.
in a
So
cave for 20 years.
yeah, totally. Um, I don't know if I see a growing interest in flow so much. But I think it's hard for us to know that we're kind of too close to it, I think. Um,
Yeah.
I think, with increased quality of life, people are more interested in these things. And
Mm,
flow is quite linked to productivity. So,
that's true.
workplaces, I think, are becoming more interested in flow. But we might be heading towards more austerity in Europe. I don't, there's a cost of living crisis right now in the UK, and I
Hmm.
think those sorts of turns in history do not help. I don't think for these sorts of interests in quality experience, because people become more distracted with sort of, you know, basic living challenges,
Right.
which is a real reality, right? Um, so I don't know. I think we'll see how it goes.
Mm,
But I think,
yeah,
we're definitely not becoming less interested in outcomes and achievement. Um,
that's very true.
so
That's
yeah, I
very
don't
true.
know.
Watch this space.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that was an immensely enjoyable conversation, Sue, as always, and maybe we can
As
do
it
this
is with
again
you, Hazel.
sometime.
You're always happy to speak with you, and yeah, that you ask great questions, and I guess this self-improvement, this mastery comes through in your interview questions, like just
Yeah, well,
keep drilling down
conversation is
and
probably the other place I find flow, and it's very starkly obvious when you do not have flow in conversation, isn't
it
it?
sure is.
Like,
And
um,
yeah, I feel like this has been a flow experience. Hopefully the listener can observe some of that, but if not, you and I have had a great experience here, being able to sort of connect from different parts of the world, about our common love for flow, and how to make flow more happen in life, and mindfulness is one of those ways that it can.
yeah, no, very grateful. Yeah, thanks a lot, and keep doing what you're doing.
And you too, Hazel. um, very much so. I think that you're really having a wonderful impact, in the world of climbing, and helping change perceptions about what climbing is, and about why we do it, and what we can learn from it. So good on you.
Cool.
Keep
Thank
doing
you.
it.
Thanks a lot.